The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883, and it changed everything Henrietta Garrison had ever believed about the direction of her life. She had been standing behind the counter of her father's dry goods store in Millhaven, Kansas, a town so flat and featureless that on a clear day you could watch a man ride away for what seemed like an hour before he finally disappeared into the horizon. She had been counting bolts of calico and trying not to think about the fact that she was 24 years old, unmarried, and living in a town that offered her exactly nothing in the way of a future. Then old Pete Mallory had pushed through the door with the afternoon post, tossed a bundle of envelopes onto the counter, and shuffled back out again without a word, as was his custom. Most of the letters were for her father, bills and orders from suppliers in Wichita and Dodge City. But one envelope was addressed directly to her in a handwriting she did not recognize, looping and careful. The letters pressed hard into the paper as though the writer had been very deliberate about each one. The return address read, Langston Ranch, Clearwater Creek, Texas. She almost did not open it. She had heard stories, of course, about women who answered advertisements from ranchers and cattlemen out west, women who packed everything they owned into a single trunk and rode south or west into the unknown on the promise of a home and a husband. She had heard the stories, and she had always thought those women must be very desperate or very brave or some equal measure of both. She had never imagined she would find herself considering becoming one of them. But her father was ailing, and the store was barely surviving, and her older sister had married a school teacher in Topeka who made enough money to support the whole family if they needed him to. Henrietta was the one without a plan. She was the one who had stayed, and she was the one who was slowly beginning to understand that staying meant disappearing slowly into the beige sameness of Millhaven until there was nothing left of her that was worth looking at. She opened the letter. It was from a man named Daniel Langston, and it was not what she expected. She had anticipated something transactional, something clipped and businesslike, a list of requirements the way a man might write out specifications for a piece of farm equipment. Instead, Daniel Langston wrote the way a man speaks when he is choosing his words very carefully because he is afraid of saying the wrong thing. He told her he was 28 years old. He told her he had a cattle ranch of 400 acres along Clearwater Creek in Caldwell County, Texas, that he had built it himself over 7 years starting from a single parcel of land his father had left him when he died. He told her he had 2 hands who worked the ranch with him, a man named Amos who had been with him since the beginning, and a younger man named Coop who was still learning the trade. He told her he was not good at talking about himself, and that the advertisement he had placed in the Kansas City Star had been Amos's idea, and that he had rewritten it 4 times before he thought it sounded like something a decent woman might respond to. Then he wrote something that stopped Henrietta's breath for a full moment. He wrote, "I'm not looking for a housekeeper or a cook. I know there are men who advertise for that sort of arrangement and dress it up as a marriage proposal, and I want you to know from the start that I am not one of them. I am looking for a partner, someone who wants to build something alongside another person rather than alone. I do not know if you are that person, but something about the way you wrote your letter made me think you might be." Henrietta read that paragraph 3 times. Then she looked up at the window of the dry goods store, at the flat, empty Kansas sky beyond the glass, and she made a decision. She wrote back the same evening. The exchange of letters that followed over the next 6 weeks was unlike anything Henrietta had experienced before. She had known young men in Millhaven, had even entertained the attentions of a farmer named Gerald Howell for a period of about 3 months the previous year, but Gerald had talked exclusively about soil composition and the price of corn, and the sum total of their courtship had been 3 suppers at her father's table and 1 handshake when it was over. Daniel Langston wrote letters that made her think. He had opinions about things, strong ones, and he expressed them with a directness that she found both startling and refreshing. He wrote about the land, about the way the Texas Hill Country looked in the early morning when the sun was just beginning to press itself up over the eastern ridge, and the whole world was still caught between night and day, and everything had that particular quality of light that he had never found words for and still could not, though he kept trying. He wrote about the injustice of the land disputes that plagued the smaller ranchers, how the large cattle companies from up north kept pushing west and south, and swallowing up land that other men had worked for years to develop, and how it made him angry in a quiet, sustained way that he could not always explain. He wrote about his horse, a sorrel gelding named Captain, with such evident affection that Henrietta found herself smiling at the page. She wrote back with equal honesty. She told him about Millhaven, about her father's cough that had been getting worse all winter, about the way she had read every book in the small lending library twice, and was beginning to feel like the walls of the place were closing in on her by measurable degrees each year. She told him she was not afraid of hard work. She told him she could ride, though not expertly, and that she could cook a decent meal but would not pretend to be any great talent in the kitchen. She told him she had strong opinions about most things and had been told on more than one occasion that this was not an attractive quality in a woman, and that she had decided some years ago to ignore that particular piece of advice. His response to that last admission arrived 10 days later. It said only, "Good. A woman without opinions is just furniture." She packed her trunk 2 weeks after that. The journey from Millhaven, Kansas to Clearwater Creek, Texas in the spring of 1883 was not a short one. She took the train from Millhaven to Wichita, then south on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line to Caldwell, which was as far south as the railroad went in that part of the country. From Caldwell, she would need to arrange a stage or some other conveyance west into the hill country, which was the detail she was still working out when the train pulled into the Caldwell station, and she stepped down onto the platform with her trunk and her traveling bag, and found herself standing in what was very obviously one of the rougher towns she had ever encountered. Caldwell in 1883 was known as the Queen of the Cowtones, which was a fine title that disguised the fact that it was also one of the most violent places on the southern plains. The cattle trade brought money and it brought men, and those two things together in the wrong proportions brought trouble. Henrietta had grown up hearing stories about the cow towns, but growing up hearing stories about something is a very different experience from standing on the platform of one with your trunk at your feet and no clear idea of what comes next. She squared her shoulders and picked up her traveling bag and went to find the stage depot. What she found instead was a tall man leaning against the post office wall across the street, with his arms folded over his chest and his hat pulled low, watching her with an expression she could not yet read from that distance. He was dark-haired and lean in the way that men who work outdoors develop, not thin but stripped down to the essentials, with a jaw that needed a razor and boots that were well worn and clean. He was watching her the way a person watches something they are trying to identify from a distance, and when she met his gaze across the dusty street, he pushed himself off the wall and walked toward her with a directness that she might have found alarming if something in the way he moved had not struck her as fundamentally unhurried and unthreatening. He stopped at the edge of the platform and took his hat off with a hand that was rough and calloused from work and said, "Are you Henrietta Garrison?" She said, "I am." He said, "I'm Daniel Langston." She had not expected him to come and collect her himself. In his last letter he had mentioned arranging transportation from Caldwell, and she had assumed he meant the stage. Looking at him now, she was not sure what she had imagined from his letters, but whatever it was had not included the particular way the afternoon light caught the angles of his face or the fact that his eyes, now that he was close enough for her to see them properly, were the color of worn denim, a blue so faded it was almost gray but not quite. She said, "I thought you meant the stage." He said, "Stage takes 3 days and goes the long way around." "I thought you'd probably had enough of traveling." A pause. "Unless you'd prefer the stage, it's your choice." she said. "I would not prefer the stage." Something shifted in his face that was not quite a smile but was close to one, and he picked up her trunk without asking and carried it to where his wagon was hitched at the end of the street, a solid, practical wagon with a good-looking team of bays. He had tied Captain, the sorrel gelding, to the back, and Henrietta recognized the horse from the description in his letters and felt an immediate and irrational fondness for it. The drive from Caldwell to Clearwater Creek was just over 2 days, camping one night along the way. Henrietta had expected awkwardness, and there was some. The particular awkwardness of two people who have shared a great deal of themselves on paper suddenly finding themselves in the physical reality of each other's company. But Daniel Langston drove with an easy competence that settled the nerves of the horses, and by extension settled something in Henrietta as well. And after the first hour, she found that the silence between them was not uncomfortable the way silences with strangers usually are. She asked him about the ranch. He talked about it the same way he had written about it, precisely and with clear affection. And she listened and asked questions, and found that the picture she had assembled from his letters matched the man beside her more closely than she had dared to hope. They made camp that first night beside a creek that was just beginning to run with the spring snowmelt from further north, and Daniel built a fire with the efficiency of a man who has done it thousands of times, and produced a surprisingly good supper from a kit in the wagon bed. They sat on opposite sides of the fire in the warm Texas darkness, and the stars over them were more numerous than anything Henrietta had ever seen in Kansas, spread across the sky in a profusion that was almost reckless. She said, "Your letters sounded like you." He looked up from the fire. "Is that a good thing?" she said. "It's the best thing. I have met men whose letters were entirely different from the men themselves, usually because the letter was written by someone else." He said, "I wrote mine 4 times. Amos said the first 3 were too stiff." She said, "What happened to Amos's wife? You never mentioned one." There was a brief pause, and then Daniel said, "Amos isn't married. He's been with me since I bought the land. He's about 50 years old and says he married the ranch and that's sufficient for him. I think he's just comfortable." Another pause. "He'll want to give you his opinion on everything. I'm warning you in advance." She laughed, and it was the first time she had laughed in what felt like a very long time, a real laugh, not a polite one, and she saw Daniel Langston watching her with an expression she could not entirely interpret, but that made something warm move through her chest. He said, "It's good to hear that." She looked at him across the fire. "Hear what?" he said. "You laughing. Your letters were thoughtful, but I wasn't sure if you were a person who laughed easily." He looked back at the fire as though he had said more than he intended. "It matters. Out here. It's a long winter if you can't find something to laugh about," she said. "I laugh easily when there is something worth laughing at." They arrived at the Langston Ranch on the afternoon of the second day, coming over a low ridge and seeing it laid out below them in the long light of a spring afternoon. The house was solidly built from limestone, the way the Texas Hill country houses were, with a good tin roof and a porch that ran the length of the front, and a kitchen garden that had been recently turned but not yet planted. There was a large barn, well-maintained, and 2 smaller outbuildings, and a series of good solid fences enclosing pastures where Henrietta could see cattle grazing in the distance. Amos was waiting on the porch. He was a broad, weathered man with a white beard, and a look about him that suggested he had strong opinions about everything, and had never once been persuaded to keep them to himself. He stood up from his chair when the wagon came through the gate and looked at Henrietta with an expression of frank assessment that reminded her of the way men examine horses at auction. He said, "You're taller than I thought," she said. "You're shorter than I thought." There was a moment of absolute silence, and then Amos laughed so hard he had to sit back down in his chair. Daniel looked sideways at Henrietta with an expression that suggested she had just passed some test she had not known she was taking. Coop turned out to be 20 years old, and so shy that, for the first 2 days, he addressed all his remarks to the middle distance somewhere behind Henrietta's left shoulder rather than directly at her. He was a good-looking boy with an easy smile and a genuine talent with horses, and Henrietta liked him immediately, which seemed to relax him by increments over the course of the first week. The question of how the arrangement would actually work had been implicit in all their letters but never fully spoken. She and Daniel were technically engaged, in the sense that the advertisement had been for a wife, and she had answered it and come. But neither of them had said the word marriage out loud yet, and in the reality of the ranch, it seemed less pressing and more complicated than it had appeared on paper. She had her own room in the house, the smaller of the two bedrooms, with a window that looked east toward the creek, and a good iron bed that Daniel had brought in from Caldwell at some point during the previous year, as though he had been preparing for her arrival even before he wrote the letter. She explored the house and the kitchen garden on that first afternoon, taking stock of what there was and what was needed, and by evening she had a list of things she wanted to discuss with him. She found him in the barn after supper and presented the list with a directness that made him blink, and then he read through it carefully and said, "Most of this is right. The fence section by the south pasture, that's already on my list. I've been meaning to get to it." He handed the paper back to her. "What do you want to plant in the kitchen garden?" She had strong opinions about this too, and they talked about it for half an hour in the lantern light of the barn, while Captain moved quietly in his stall nearby, and it was one of the most comfortable conversations she could remember having with another person. That was the pattern of the first weeks. They worked alongside each other and talked and slowly closed the distance between who they were on paper and who they were in the flesh. She took over the cooking, not because it was expected, but because she genuinely wanted to, and she was better at it than she had let on in her letters, a fact which Amos discovered and loudly announced to Daniel, as though it were something Daniel needed to be informed of immediately. She learned the routines of the ranch and inserted herself into them with a practicality that seemed to surprise everyone, including Daniel. She was not afraid of difficult work. She had never been afraid of it. In Millhaven, it had simply never been available to her in any form that felt meaningful. What she had not anticipated was how quickly she would begin to feel things for him. It started in small ways. The way he listened when she talked, with the full weight of his attention, without interrupting or looking elsewhere. The way he was with his animals, patient and consistent and without cruelty, which told her more about the quality of his character than any number of conversations could have. The way he looked sometimes when he came in from a long day's work, standing at the basin in the kitchen to wash up, tired and quiet and utterly without pretense, and she would feel something catch in her chest that she was not yet ready to name. He was careful with her. Careful in the way that a man is careful with something he values and does not want to damage through carelessness. He never assumed things about her time or her preferences. He always asked. He talked to her as though her opinions mattered, which they did, and which she had spent long enough around men who did not believe this to find it remarkable and slightly disorienting. There were moments between them that were charged with something neither of them addressed directly. Moments when they stood too close to each other over a piece of work or a map of the pasture boundaries. Moments when their hands came near each other or their eyes met for a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary. And then the moment would pass and they would move apart and continue as before. It was Amos, of course, who brought it to a head. It was about 6 weeks after her arrival, on a Wednesday evening when they were all sitting on the porch after supper in the soft spring air, and Amos put down his coffee cup and said, without preamble, "When are you two planning on getting married? Because if you're waiting for the right moment, I should inform you that in my experience the right moment almost never arrives on its own." Henrietta felt a wave of heat move up her neck. Beside her, Daniel was very still. Coop said from the far end of the porch, "Amos." Amos said, "Don't Amos me. I'm old and I don't have time for people being circuitous." There was a silence that stretched out over the sound of the spring night, the frogs down at the creek and the distant low of cattle and the wind moving through the live oak at the corner of the house. Then Daniel said, not looking at Amos but looking at Henrietta with the directness that was one of his most identifiable qualities, "I was going to ask. I've been trying to find the right way to do it." Henrietta met his eyes. She said, "There is no right way. There is just asking." He said, "Would you marry me, Henrietta?" She said, "Yes, I will marry you, Daniel." Amos picked up his coffee cup and said, "Excellent, Coop, you owe me 50 cents. Coop groaned from the end of the porch. They were married 3 weeks later in Caldwell, because that was where the nearest minister was, at the small Methodist church on the main street that looked somewhat out of place among the saloons and cattle pens of that rowdy countenance. Henrietta wore a dress she had brought from Millhaven, white cotton with blue ribbon trim at the collar and cuffs, and she had done her dark hair up properly for the first time in weeks. Daniel had come in a clean shirt and his good jacket and had shaved, and when she came through the door of the church and saw him standing there at the front, he looked at her with an expression so open and unguarded that she had to look down at the floor for a moment to collect herself. Amos stood up as witness. Coop stood beside him and looked as though he might cry, which he absolutely denied afterward with great vehemence. The minister was a small, kind man named Reverend Alcott, who seemed genuinely moved by the seriousness with which both of them made their vows. And when he pronounced them married and Daniel kissed her for the first time, it was quiet and brief and entirely real. Not showy or performative, but the kind of kiss that contains an entire conversation and a promise and an acknowledgement all at once. And Henrietta felt it down to the soles of her boots. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon with Amos singing badly in the wagon bed, and Coop trying to get him to stop, and Daniel's hand found hers on the seat between them, and he did not let go the entire drive home. The summer that followed was the happiest period of Henrietta Garrison's life, though she would not have used those words at the time because she was not the type of person who catalogued her own happiness in such direct terms. She would have said it was a good summer, a productive one, but the truth was more than that. She and Daniel worked the ranch together through the long, blazing Texas summer, and the work was hard and unrelenting, and she loved it. She took over the kitchen garden with genuine enthusiasm and produced a harvest of tomatoes and beans and squash and peppers that kept them all fed through the hottest months and filled several dozen jars for the winter. She learned to ride properly, something she had always wanted to do, and Daniel taught her with the same patient consistency he applied to everything, never making her feel foolish for the things she did not yet know. She progressed from the steadiest of the wagon horses to Captain's little sister, a chestnut mare that Daniel kept for working cattle and that Henrietta named Clara after her grandmother. And by the end of summer, she was riding well enough to accompany the men on short drives. She and Daniel talked. This was perhaps the thing she loved best, the fact that they talked the way she had always wanted to talk to another person, about real things and difficult things and funny things and things that had no resolution, but were interesting to think about together. They talked in the evenings on the porch, and at breakfast, and sometimes in the middle of the day's work, when something occurred to one of them that needed to be shared. He was not a man who talked for the sake of talking, which meant that when he did say something she always listened, and she found that he extended her the same courtesy. She wrote to her father in Millhaven, long letters full of detail about the ranch and the country and the life she was building. Her father wrote back in his cramped handwriting that she was sounding like herself again, and that whatever Texas was doing for her, he was glad of it. She missed him steadily, the way you miss a person who is part of the fabric of your daily life, but she did not regret coming. She would have regretted staying. In August there was a cattle drive, a 3-day affair to move a portion of the herd to market at a shipping point north of Caldwell, and Henrietta went along for the first day to help with the initial push. She rode Clara and kept pace with Coop on the flank of the herd as the cattle moved north through the short scrub and limestone country, and she understood for the first time in a direct and physical way why men loved this work, why it got into them the way it did. There was something about moving a herd of cattle across open country in the early morning, the sound and smell of it, and the particular quality of attention it required, that reached some part of her she had not known was there. Daniel rode point at the front of the drive, and occasionally she could see him from her position on the flank, a silhouette in the dust and morning light, and she felt something so clearly and simply that it startled her. She was in love with him, not in the uncertain, tentative way she had been moving toward feeling since her arrival, but fully and without reservation, in the way that once you have recognized it, there is no possibility of misidentifying it as anything else. She did not tell him immediately. She turned it over for a few days, this knowledge, examining it from different angles the way she would examine any other piece of important information before deciding what to do with it. She was not afraid to tell him. She simply wanted to find the right moment, which she now understood, given Amos's earlier speech, might not arrive on its own. She found it on a Sunday evening in late August when the heat had finally broken, and there was an actual breeze coming up the creek valley, and the sky was doing something spectacular with shades of orange and red in the west. They were sitting on the porch together after supper, which was where they most often ended the day, and Amos and Coop had both gone to their quarters in the bunkhouse, and it was just the two of them in the settling dark. She said, "Daniel." He said, the sound of a man who is thinking about something else but is giving her his attention. She said, "I am in love with you." He turned and looked at her. She met his eyes. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, which in the particular silence of a Texas summer evening is quite a long time. He said, "I've been in love with you since your second letter." She said, "You should have told me." He said, "I kept thinking it was too soon, that you needed time, a pause." "Was it too soon?" She said. "It was 6 weeks ago, Daniel." He said, "I know." He reached over and took her hand, and when he looked at her there was nothing guarded in his face at all, none of the careful deliberateness that was part of his ordinary manner, just something entirely open and warm and true. "I love you, Henrietta," she said. "I know. I have known for a while. I was waiting for you to say it." He looked at her for a moment and then laughed, not the polite kind but real and warm, and she laughed too, and the evening settled around them like something that had finally found its right shape. After that, things were different between them in the way that acknowledging a truth always changes the landscape it exists in. Not dramatically different, not in any way that would have been obvious to an outside observer, but different in the texture of their daily life together, a new warmth and ease that expressed itself in small things. The way he touched the back of her hand when he passed her in the kitchen, the way she rested her shoulder against his when they sat side by side in the evening, the way they sometimes looked at each other across a room or a distance of open ground, and the look contained everything that needed to be said. Amos observed all of this with visible satisfaction and kept his commentary to a minimum, which was perhaps the greatest gift he gave them. The trouble arrived in September, as trouble in the Texas Hill Country had a tendency to do, arriving quietly and from a direction nobody had quite anticipated. The large Pemberton Cattle Company, which had been buying up or squeezing out smaller ranches along the Clearwater Creek drainage for the past 2 years, sent a man named Harlan Voss to the Langston Ranch on a Thursday morning when Daniel was out checking the east fence line with Coop. Henrietta was the one who met him at the gate. Voss was a heavy-set man in an expensive suit that was conspicuously wrong for the Texas back country, with a way of looking at people that suggested he had long since decided he was more important than most of them. He presented a card, very formally, and told her that the Pemberton Cattle Company was making the Langston Ranch an offer to purchase the property, and that the offer was generous, and that he would appreciate a conversation with her husband at her earliest convenience. Henrietta looked at the card and then at Voss and said, with complete pleasantness, "Mr. Voss, I will certainly tell my husband you called. Would you like to leave the figures of your offer in writing, or would you prefer to come back when he is available?" Voss said the offer was better discussed in person, and added, with a particular kind of emphasis that she recognized immediately, that ranching was a difficult business in this country, and that many families found it was in their best interest to take what they could while the offer was still on the table. She said, still pleasant, "I'll be sure to pass that along." He left, and she went straight to her kitchen table and wrote down everything he had said, every word, in the order he had said it, so she would have it exactly right when Daniel returned. When Daniel came back that evening and she told him, his face went through several things in quick succession before settling into a controlled steadiness that she now recognized as his version of serious anger. He read her notes carefully and then put the paper down on the table. He said, "They've done this to 3 other ranchers along the creek in the past 2 years. Dawson sold after they ran his cattle off twice. The Morrisons left after their barn burned." He said this without dramatics, stating facts. "They've been patient about it. They wait until there's enough pressure, and then they make the offer, and by that point people are usually willing to take it." She said, "What are we going to do?" He looked at her. He said, "Nothing to do but hold the line, keep the fences good, make sure nothing happens to the herd that doesn't have an obvious natural explanation." A pause. "It might get harder before it gets easier," she said. "I'm not going anywhere, Daniel." Something moved through his eyes. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers and said, "I know, I'm glad of it." The following weeks confirmed his assessment. There were small things. A section of fence that had been cut overnight, a water source near the south pasture that was suddenly mudded and fouled. Nothing that could be definitively attributed to anyone, nothing that constituted clear proof of interference, just consistent, grinding pressure. Daniel was methodical about it. He and Coop began writing the fence lines every day. He sent a letter to the county sheriff in Caldwell, a measured and factual account of what had occurred, and received in return a response that was polite and non-committal in a way that told him the sheriff understood which way the prevailing wind was blowing. Henrietta, meanwhile, had been thinking. She had a more systematic mind than she was always given credit for, and she spent several evenings in October going through the land registry records that Daniel kept in a tin box in the study, cross-referencing them with some information she had obtained through careful correspondence with the land office in Austin. What she found was interesting. She presented her findings to Daniel on a Thursday evening with the papers spread on the kitchen table. She said, "The Pemberton Company filed a water rights claim on Clearwater Creek 8 months ago. But there is a prior claim on record from a man named Ephraim Bell who settled this land in 1871 and sold it to you in 1876. The water rights should have transferred with the land, but they were never formally registered at the state level." Daniel leaned over the papers and followed what she was pointing at. He said, "I didn't know there was a state registration requirement." She said, "Most people didn't. It's a relatively new requirement from 1879, but it means that on paper the water rights are currently unclaimed, which is what the Pemberton Company is counting on. If they can establish their claim first, they can effectively control who uses the creek and on what terms." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "How did you find this?" She said, "I wrote to the land office and asked them to send me the relevant statutes. It took 3 weeks to arrive, but they sent a complete set." He said, very quietly and with a weight of feeling that she recognized, "Henrietta," she said, "we need a lawyer, someone in Austin, not Caldwell, someone far enough from the Pemberton Company's influence that we can count on them to represent us properly." He said, "I know a man, Reeves Monroe. He practices in San Antonio. He helped a rancher out of a similar situation down in Bixar County 3 years ago." He paused. "It'll take money," she said. "I know. I've been thinking about that too." She slid another piece of paper across the table. "I've been keeping careful accounts since I arrived. The fall cattle sale did better than the books show it should have, because Amos sold 4 animals privately that never made it into the official ledger. Don't tell him I know that. It'll embarrass him. But with the private sale money added back in and the surplus from the kitchen garden sales at the Caldwell market, we have enough to retain a lawyer." Daniel looked at the paper and then at her, and there was something on his face that went beyond gratitude, something more fundamental than that. He said, "Where did you learn all this?" she said. "I grew up in a store. You learn to keep accounts when you grow up in a store. And I like figuring things out. I always have." She gathered the papers into a neat stack. "Shall I write to Mr. Monroe?" he said. "Please." She wrote to Reeves Monroe that same evening, a clear and comprehensive letter laying out the facts of the situation in logical order. And within 2 weeks Monroe had responded with a letter of his own that confirmed her reading of the land registry situation and indicated that a formal water rights claim could be filed, and the Pemberton Company's application contested on the grounds of prior use. The legal process was slow, as legal processes are, and the autumn moved forward with the ranch's daily demands continuing regardless of the paperwork making its way between them and San Antonio and the state land office in Austin. The cattle needed to be tended, and the fences needed to be ridden, and the kitchen needed feeding, and the garden needed to be put to bed for winter. Life did not pause for difficulty, which was both challenging and, in the particular way of the ranch, something that Henrietta found clarifying. There was an evening in November when she was in the kitchen putting up the last of the fall preserves, and Daniel came in from the pasture with the particular quality of tiredness that comes from a day that has asked more than it should have, and he sat down at the kitchen table and she poured him coffee and sat down across from him and said, without asking, "Tell me." He said, "The northwest pasture fence was cut again. 3 sections. The cattle moved into the open range and we spent 4 hours getting them back." She said, "Was anyone hurt?" He said, "No." A pause. "Coop's horse picked up a stone and went lame, so he'll be out of work for a few days. Nothing serious." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and looked at the table. "I keep wondering if I'm being stubborn about this, whether it's worth it, whether it would be simpler to take the money and move somewhere else." She looked at him and said, "Is that what you want?" He looked up. He said, "No," she said. "Then it's not simpler. Taking the easy thing when it's not the right thing only looks simpler from a distance." She met his eyes. "This is your land. You built it. We are not going to let them push us off it." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You said we." She said, "It's been we for some time, Daniel. I assumed you'd noticed." He stood up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and pulled her to her feet and held her, not dramatically but solidly, the way a person holds something they do not intend to let go of. She pressed her face against the worn cotton of his shirt and felt the steadiness of him and thought that this, exactly this, was worth every mile of the journey from Millhaven. He said into her hair, "I love you," she said. "I know. I love you too. Now drink your coffee before it gets cold." He laughed, low and warm, and kissed the top of her head, and they sat back down across from each other and talked through what needed to happen next with the clear-eyed practicality that had become one of the defining features of how they worked together. Winter in the Texas Hill Country was milder than what Henrietta had known in Kansas, but not without its difficulties. The days were short, and the wind had an edge that cut through clothing in ways the summer heat had not prepared her for. She settled into the rhythm of the indoor months with the same practicality she brought to everything, laying in supplies and organizing the root cellar, and beginning the seeds for the spring kitchen garden in small clay pots near the south-facing window. She also continued corresponding with Reeves Monroe, who was making progress on the water rights claim. By January, he was able to report that the formal registration of the Langston prior water rights claim had been accepted at the state level, and that the Pemberton Company's competing application had been challenged. The process would take several more months, Monroe wrote, but he was confident in the outcome. In December, Henrietta began to suspect she was with child. She kept the suspicion to herself for several weeks, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to be certain before she said anything, and certainty in these matters took time. By January she was certain, and she told Daniel on a cold Wednesday morning when they were the only 2 people in the kitchen, and the sound of the wind off the ridge was wrapping itself around the corners of the limestone house. She said, "Daniel, I think we are going to have a baby." He set down his coffee cup very carefully on the table. He turned and looked at her. She watched him work through it, the first startled attention, and then something opening in his face that she had no name for because she had never seen it on anyone before, a particular and unreserved joy. He said, "Henrietta," she said, "approximately July, I think." He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and took her face in his hands and looked at her with that open, unguarded expression that she had first seen at the church in Caldwell and that never failed to move her, and he said, "Are you well?" "Are you feeling all right?" she said. "I feel perfectly fine. Perhaps a little tired in the mornings, but otherwise entirely fine." He said, "We need the doctor." She said, "The doctor is in Caldwell and I am perfectly healthy and we will see the doctor in the spring when the roads are better." He looked like he wanted to argue with this and thought better of it, which was a sign of how well he had come to know her. He kissed her instead, warmly and thoroughly, and then held her close with his chin resting on the top of her head and said, very quietly, "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. "For coming, for being here, for everything." Amos, who had apparently been listening from somewhere in the vicinity of the back door that he had entered without announcing himself, said loudly, "I hope it's a boy. This ranch needs more men who know how to work." Coop, from somewhere further back, said, "Amos." Amos said, "I'm still not going to apologize for listening. I'm old and I've earned my opinions." Spring came with the particular intensity of a Texas spring, everything erupting at once, the bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush flooding the hillsides and the creek running full and the air full of the smell of new growth and warm earth. The water rights case had been progressing through the administrative process in Austin, and in March Reeves Monroe sent a letter that made Henrietta read it twice to make sure she had understood correctly. The state land office had ruled in favor of the prior claim. The Langston water rights to Clearwater Creek were officially registered in the name of Langston Ranch as of the filing date, and the Pemberton Company's competing application had been denied on the grounds that the prior use was sufficiently established. Monroe enclosed the formal documentation along with his invoice, which was substantial but entirely fair given what he had accomplished. Henrietta took the letter out to where Daniel was working on the barn roof with Coop and read it aloud to him, while he stood on the ladder with the hammer still in his hand. He came down off the ladder slowly and read the letter himself, and then read it again and then looked up at her with an expression of such relief that she felt her own chest tighten with it. He said, "It's over," she said. "The water rights are secured. They may still make trouble, but without the water rights claim they have no legal leverage." She folded the letter carefully. "I will write to Mr. Monroe and thank him." Coop, from the top of the barn, said, "Are we celebrating?" Amos appeared from the direction of the vegetable garden, where he had been doing something ostensibly helpful, and said, "Of course we're celebrating. What kind of people don't celebrate a victory?" Coop slid down from the barn roof with an agility that made Henrietta wince slightly and said, "I'll ride into Caldwell for some supplies if anyone has a list." Henrietta, who always had a list, produced one from her apron pocket, because this was precisely the kind of household she ran, and sent him on his way. That evening they had the kind of supper that required all 4 of them at the kitchen table, and lasted for 3 hours, full of food and conversation and laughter, and Henrietta sat at one end of the table and looked down its length at Daniel at the other end, and felt something so complete and solid in her chest that she thought this must be what it means to have built something real. As the weather warmed toward summer, Henrietta's pregnancy became increasingly visible and increasingly managed by the combined opinions of every person on the ranch. Amos had discovered a considerable store of knowledge on the subject from sources he declined to specify, and delivered it in daily installments whether or not anyone had asked for it. Coop became protective in a way that was sweet and occasionally slightly suffocating, appearing at inconvenient moments to ask if she needed help with anything. Daniel walked a careful line between the attentiveness that she appreciated and the overcaution that she found unnecessary, and for the most part he managed it well, guided partly by her willingness to tell him directly when he was being excessive. She rode Clara through May, not on cattle work but on the light morning rides she had come to love, up along the creek and through the lower section of the hill country where the spring flowers were still holding on. In June, Daniel asked her with the careful tone of a man raising a topic he knows is delicate if she might consider not riding until after the baby. She considered it for a day and then said, "Yes, all right, but I reserve the right to change my mind." He said, "Agreed, completely your choice." She looked at him. She said, "You did that very well," he said. "I've been practicing." She laughed and he looked pleased with himself in a way that she found endearing. The doctor, a competent and good-natured man named Dr. Thatcher, who made the trip from Caldwell on horseback in July, declared her healthy and the baby well-positioned, and arrived 2 weeks later when she needed him. The labor was long but not complicated, and Daniel was in the house the entire time, which was perhaps not the conventional arrangement but which was exactly what Henrietta wanted, and which he undertook with a steady composure that she later told him she had not entirely expected, and for which she was genuinely grateful. Their son was born on a hot July morning in 1884, red-faced and loud about it, with his father's dark hair and a considerable opinion of the world that expressed itself at full volume from his first moment in it. They named him Samuel, after Daniel's father, with the middle name James after Henrietta's. Amos came to the door of the bedroom and looked at the baby with an expression of complex emotion that he immediately disguised as critical assessment. He said, "Good size." "Good lungs." He looked at Henrietta. "You did well," she said. "Thank you, Amos," he said. "The boy's going to need someone to teach him to work cattle properly. I volunteer." She said, "He needs to be able to sit up first." Amos said, "We'll start small." He went back out to the porch, and she heard him tell Coop in a voice carefully calibrated to carry that it was a boy and a healthy one, and she heard Coop make a sound of genuine joy that she filed away in her heart, alongside all the other things on the ranch that she had not expected to love as much as she did. Daniel was sitting on the edge of the bed beside her with Samuel in the crook of his arm, looking down at the baby with the expression of a man who has been fundamentally rearranged by something, and is only beginning to understand the full extent of the rearrangement. He looked up at Henrietta and she saw in his face everything she needed to see. He said, "Samuel James Langston," she said. "He looks like you," he said. "He looks like a small, angry person," she said. "He also looks like you." He looked at her for a moment with that particular warmth that was specific to him, and then leaned over carefully so as not to disturb the baby and kissed her temple, and she closed her eyes and rested. The months that followed Samuel's birth were the fullest that Henrietta had yet known, which was saying something given the fullness of the years that had preceded them. The baby was a constant and demanding reality, vivid in the way that small creatures are vivid, requiring everything and giving back something she had not had words for before she experienced it. She loved Samuel with a completeness that astonished her, which was not something she had doubted in theory, but which in practice turned out to be even more total than theory had suggested. Daniel was, to her complete lack of surprise by this point, an excellent father. He was patient with the night wakings, and willing to learn what the baby needed and unsentimental about the practicalities of infant care, in a way that she appreciated enormously. He held Samuel while she worked and walked him in the evenings when he fussed and talked to him in the quiet way he talked to his animals, steadily and without any apparent self-consciousness about it. Amos, true to his word, appeared at regular intervals to introduce Samuel to aspects of ranch life that were not yet relevant to a baby. By October, he had carried the boy on a tour of the barn, introducing him to each horse by name. Samuel had looked at the horses with the wide, unfocused attention of a very young baby, and Amos had declared this to be evidence of a natural affinity. The Pemberton Company made one more attempt at pressure the following spring, sending Harlan Voss back with a revised offer that was marginally better than the first. Voss came to the front gate this time and waited there until Daniel came out to speak with him, because apparently the experience of his first visit with Henrietta had adjusted his approach somewhat. Daniel listened to the offer with complete politeness, and then said, in a voice entirely without rancor, that the ranch was not for sale and would not be for sale, and that the water rights were formally registered with the state of Texas, and that any further interference with the property or the herd would result in a formal complaint to the state authorities, as well as a civil claim that Reeves Monroe had already prepared the groundwork for. He said all of this the way he said most things, quietly and without decoration, and Voss looked at him for a long moment and then got back on his horse and rode away. He did not come back. The Pemberton Company moved its attention further west over the following year, and the pressure on Clearwater Creek eased the way a headache eases, gradually and then all at once. The Dawsons, who had sold their land the previous year, were gone and could not come back, and that loss sat with Daniel for a long time, the knowledge that two of their neighbors had been pushed out before the situation had resolved. It was an injustice that had a permanent quality to it, and he did not pretend otherwise, but he also could not undo it. What he could do was what he did, which was to hold his own ground and to make the Langston Ranch something worth holding. Over the years that followed, the ranch grew, not dramatically or quickly but steadily, which was consistent with everything about the way Daniel worked. He added a section of grazing land along the East Ridge in 1886, and another water right along a secondary creek in 1887, and the herd grew accordingly. Coop stayed, and eventually became a full partner in the cattle operation in the informal way that things happen on working ranches, earning a share of the profit and a permanent place in the life of the place. He remained happily unmarried and claimed, as Amos did, that the ranch was sufficient, though Henrietta had her private opinions about this which she kept to herself. Amos aged the way very tough things age, slowly and without much visible change, getting more weathered and more opinionated in roughly equal proportions. He had long since established himself as Samuel's primary instructor in all things related to horses and cattle and the general philosophy of ranch life, a role he took entirely seriously, and which Samuel, who was an observant and willing child, rewarded with genuine attention. In 1887, Henrietta was expecting again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, and the labor shorter, and their daughter arrived on a brisk October morning as decisive and fully formed, as though she had been waiting impatiently and had simply chosen her moment. They named her Eleanor for Henrietta's mother, and she had Henrietta's dark eyes and a quality of focused observation that made Amos say, when he held her for the first time, that she was going to be trouble. Samuel was 3 and found Eleanor alternately fascinating and baffling, which was about the appropriate response to a new sibling at 3. He treated her with a careful gentleness that made Henrietta watch him sometimes with a feeling she could not entirely contain, the feeling of watching someone be exactly who you had hoped they would be. The life of the ranch settled into a fullness that accommodated everything, the work and the difficulty, and the seasons and the children, and the ongoing texture of two people who had chosen each other, and continued to choose each other in the daily accumulated decisions of a shared life. This was, Henrietta had come to understand, what love looked like from the inside, not the high dramatic pitch of the feeling but the consistent, renewable choice to be present to another person and to the life you were building together. She and Daniel still talked the way they had always talked, every evening on the porch when the day's work was done, sometimes for a long time and sometimes for only a little while, depending on what the day had required of them. They disagreed on things because they were both people with strong opinions, and they disagreed honestly and without cruelty, which she had long ago decided was the most important thing. She had been right. He was still the person she most wanted to talk to about anything that mattered. In 1889, her father came to visit from Millhaven. the cough that had worried her for years having finally improved enough that he could manage the journey. He arrived on the stage from Caldwell looking thin and road-weary, but with his eyes bright, and Henrietta met him at the gate and held him for a long moment, and felt the complicated gratitude of having gone away and built something, and being able to show it to the person whose opinion mattered most to her. Her father walked the ranch with Daniel for an entire afternoon, the two of them moving at the slow pace of a man who was no longer young through the pastures and along the creek and out to the east ridge. And when they came back for supper, her father sat down at the table and looked around the kitchen at Henrietta and the two children and the organized, living reality of the household she had made and said, "I am very glad you wrote that letter." She said, "So am I, Papa." Daniel, who was at the stove because he had learned to cook during her pregnancy with a leaner out of both necessity and genuine interest and had become quite good at it, looked over his shoulder at her father and said, "So am I, sir." Her father looked at Daniel for a moment and then nodded once, a particular kind of nod that contained everything it needed to contain, and reached for the bread. The evening after her father went to bed, Henrietta and Daniel sat on the porch in the September warmth, and she looked out at the dark Texas hill country spread around the ranch and felt the completeness of things, not a completion in the sense of being finished, but a completeness in the sense of being whole. She said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't placed that advertisement?" He said, "Every time I think about it I stop because it makes me genuinely anxious to consider the alternative." She said, "You would have been fine." He said, "I would have been fine in the way that people are fine when they are managing without something essential they don't know is missing yet." He looked at her. "I wouldn't have known what I was missing. That's almost worse." She reached over and found his hand in the dark and held it, and they sat in the warm September night with the sound of the creek below the house and the stars enormous overhead and the children asleep inside and the ranch all around them, and Henrietta thought, "This is it. This is the thing." Not the story of arriving, or the story of fighting for what was theirs, or even the story of falling in love, though all those stories were real and mattered. This quiet porch in the September dark, this hand in hers, this life that they had built together from a letter and a hope and a willingness to try. She said, "I love you, Daniel." He said, "I love you, Henrietta." He paused. "I have loved you every single day since your second letter." She said, "You need to stop bringing up that second letter." He said, "I will never stop bringing up that second letter." She laughed and he did too, and the sound of it went out into the Texas dark and dissolved into the night sounds of a working ranch, the creek and the horses and the cattle and the wind in the live oaks, the sound of a life that was real and had been fought for and was still, every day, being built. The years moved forward the way years do on working land, marked by seasons and calving and planting and harvest, and the growth of children and the aging of the things and people you love. Samuel grew into a serious, capable boy who had his father's ease with animals and his mother's unflinching way of meeting the world directly and not being intimidated by it. Eleanor was, as Amos had predicted, trouble in the best possible sense, curious and determined and afraid of almost nothing, with a quality of focused intelligence that reminded Henrietta sometimes of herself at the same age and made her feel a particular fierce pride. Amos lived to 71, which he announced regularly was older than most men of his temperament deserved, and spent the last 2 years of his working life teaching Samuel everything he knew about cattle with a thoroughness and seriousness that had always characterized everything he did. When he passed, in the spring of 1893, it was quietly and at the ranch, which was where he had wanted to be, and they buried him on the high ground above the creek where you could see the whole of the Langston land spread out below in both directions, and Daniel stood at the grave for a long time after the others had gone back to the house. Henrietta stayed with him. She stood beside him and did not try to fill the silence, because this was one of the things she had learned about the man she had married, that some silences needed to be occupied rather than resolved, and she was good at that now. He said, finally, he was the first person to believe this place could be something. She said he was right. He put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood on the high ground in the spring air with the whole of the ranch below them and the sky enormous over everything. He said, "Thank you for staying." She said, "Thank you for asking." He pulled her close and she leaned against him, and they stayed there a while longer before going back down to the house and the children and the evening meal and the ongoing, irreplaceable, daily work of the life they had made together. In 1895, with Samuel 12 and Eleanor 8, they added another small room to the limestone house, a project that Daniel and Coop and a carpenter from Caldwell undertook over the course of a warm autumn, and that Henrietta supervised with the same precise attention she brought to everything, consulting frequently on structural decisions, and being entirely ignored on these by the carpenter, and entirely listened to by Daniel and Coop, which was the appropriate distribution of influence. The new room became Henrietta's study, which was what she called it with a slight defiance, because she knew there were people who would have called it impractical for a ranch wife to have a room for reading and correspondence and accounts. It had the window she specified and the shelving Daniel built for her, which went from floor to ceiling on 2 walls, and which she filled with books ordered from San Antonio and Austin, and occasionally from as far as Kansas City. She spent the winter evenings there by lamplight, reading and writing and working on the accounts, which she still kept with the same precision she had brought to them from the beginning. She wrote occasionally for the regional newspaper in Caldwell, a practical column about ranch life and the management of a household in the hill country that was read, apparently, with interest by a number of people she never met. She wrote about the kitchen garden and about preserving and about the water rights case in a form that was careful and factual, and that prompted a letter from a woman in San Antonio who was dealing with a similar situation and wanted advice. Henrietta wrote back a thorough letter and thought nothing more of it until the woman's husband sent a letter of thanks 6 months later, saying the case had resolved in their favor. She told Daniel about this, and he looked at her across the supper table and said, "You've been doing this quietly, haven't you? Helping people with this kind of thing." She said, "I just answer letters." He said, "You've answered 8 letters this year. I've seen them go out." She said, "The situation we dealt with the Pemberton Company is not unique. The large cattle companies do this systematically, and the smaller ranchers often don't know what options they have or how to find out. Someone should help them understand." A pause. "I'm just someone with a desk and a knowledge of the relevant statutes." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression he had that contained more than most people's words. He said, "You are the most remarkable person I have ever met." She said, "You're biased," he said, "enormously." She went back to her supper and tried not to smile too visibly at her plate. In the late 1890s, the West Texas cattle country changed, as it was always changing, the railroad pushing further south and new towns growing up along the lines, and the nature of the cattle trade shifting with the availability of better transport. The Langston Ranch adapted, as good operations do, finding the right markets and adjusting the size of the herd to match the economics of the moment. Coop, who had a good eye for business that had surprised everyone including himself, took on the primary responsibility for the marketing side of the operation and proved himself consistently shrewd at it. Samuel, at 15, was working cattle alongside his father and Coop and learning the full range of what the ranch required of the people who ran it. He had a natural talent for it that went beyond mere willingness to work, a genuine instinct for the animals and the land that Daniel recognized and nurtured with the same careful patience he brought to everything. He was also, like his mother, a reader, and this combination of practical capability and intellectual appetite made him someone who would have options in his life, which was exactly what both his parents wanted for him. Eleanor, at 11, had decided she was going to be a doctor, an announcement she made at the supper table one evening in the same tone she might have used to announce what she wanted for breakfast. Henrietta looked at her daughter across the table and felt the particular feeling of recognizing yourself in another person. She said, "Then you will need to study very hard." Eleanor said, "I know that." Daniel said, "There are not many women doctors." Eleanor said, "Then there should be more." Daniel looked at Henrietta across the table. She looked back at him. He said, "Your mother will help you figure out what you need to study." Eleanor said, "I know, I've already asked her." Henrietta, who had in fact already been corresponding with a women's medical college in Philadelphia on Eleanor's behalf for 3 months, said, "We have time. You are 11. Let's focus on mathematics first." Eleanor accepted this with a practical grace that reminded Henrietta of someone. As the century turned, the Langston Ranch had become one of the established fixtures of Clearwater Creek and the surrounding country. Not the largest operation in Caldwell County, but one of the most respected. Daniel's reputation as a fair dealer and a man of his word had made the ranch a place that people sought out, for cattle, and for advice, and for the simple fact that some places have a quality to them that comes from the people who inhabit them, and that people are drawn to without always being able to explain why. Henrietta's column in the Caldwell paper had expanded to a regular feature, and she had been asked twice to speak at the county agricultural meeting in Caldwell on the subject of water rights and land management, which she had done with the directness and clarity that characterized everything she put her mind to. The second time she spoke, a young woman from a failing ranch west of the county came to see her afterward with a specific legal question about a land dispute, and Henrietta spent an hour with her going through the relevant documentation and left her with a list of specific steps to take and a letter of introduction to Reeves Monroe in San Antonio, who was still practicing and who had become something of a friend over the years of correspondence. Daniel had been there for this conversation in the background, and when they drove home afterward he said, "You should charge people for that." She said, "For talking to them," he said, "for the expertise. For knowing what you know and being able to apply it in a way that helps them." She said, "Women don't charge for that sort of help." He said, "Maybe they should." She thought about this for a while as the wagon moved through the evening country. She said, "You might be right." He said, "I usually am about the important things. It's the small things where I get into trouble." She said, "Name one small thing." He said, "I still cannot correctly predict which day's coop is going to burn the noon meal when he cooks it." She laughed. He did too, and the wagon moved through the Texas evening toward home. The house on the Langston Ranch in the first years of the 20th century was a full and living place, still the limestone house that had been there from the beginning, expanded and adapted over the years but recognizable as itself, the way a person remains recognizable even as they change. The kitchen garden was larger now and better organized, tended by Henrietta with the help of a woman named Rosa from a neighboring property who had come to work for them 3 days a week, and who had strong opinions about tomatoes that she expressed in both English and Spanish with equal conviction. The barn had been rebuilt after a fire in 1898, a terrifying week that had resolved without the loss of any animals, because Daniel and Samuel and Coop had worked through an entire night to get every horse and every piece of equipment clear of the blaze before it took the structure. The rebuilt barn was better than the original, which was often how things went after a hard loss, and it stood solidly at the back of the property and smelled of good timber and horses, and the particular compound of a working stable that Henrietta had come to associate with home as directly as any other sensory detail of the place. Samuel left for an agricultural college in San Antonio at 17, and the day he rode out to the Caldwell stage was one of the hardest days the ranch had seen since Amos died. Daniel stood at the gate and watched the wagon go and did not say anything, and Henrietta stood beside him and did not say anything either, and then they went back inside and continued the day's work, because the day's work continued regardless. He came back for Christmas and the summers, and every time he returned, he was visibly more himself, which was the definition of what an education was supposed to do. He also came back with more practical skills each time, ideas about breeding programs and pasture management and water conservation that he and Daniel discussed in the evenings, with a depth and seriousness that made the kitchen table feel like the center of something that was growing forward rather than simply continuing. Alina left for Philadelphia at 18 to begin her medical studies, which she had been preparing for with meticulous determination for 7 years. Henrietta accompanied her on the train, a journey of several days that she would not have missed for anything, and installed her in the boarding house near the medical college that had been arranged, and met the house mother and the other residents, and inspected the situation with the thoroughness of a woman who has been running a ranch for 20 years and knows exactly what adequate provisions look like. Alina had said at the train station in Philadelphia, "Mama, I will be fine." Henrietta had said, "I know you will. I am checking anyway." Alina had looked at her with the expression she had been refining since approximately age 2 and said, "You know that I get that from you." Henrietta said, "I'm aware of that. Get your things settled before dark." She had cried on the train back to Kansas City, quietly and without making a production of it, because Alina was the last of her children to leave and the house was going to be very quiet. She had stopped crying before she reached Kansas City, and by the time she was on the southbound train, she had a plan for reorganizing the kitchen garden and had outlined 3 paragraphs of a new piece for the Caldwell paper. When she got home, Daniel was waiting on the porch, and she came through the gate, and he saw her face and came down the porch steps and held her, and did not say anything, which was exactly right. She said against his chest, "She's going to be fine." He said, "She is absolutely going to be fine. She's a leaner." She said, "I know, I'm just going to miss her." He said, "So am I. We'll write." She said, "We'll write." They went inside and made supper together in the quiet house and talked about Alina and about Samuel and about what needed doing on the ranch that week and about the article she was planning and about what Coop had apparently done to the fence in the north pasture that was going to require attention in the morning. They talked the way they had always talked, about everything, and the house was quieter than it had been in 20 years and also entirely full. The years of their marriage had accumulated to something that Henrietta occasionally tried to take stock of and always found exceeded her accounting. Not in grand events, though there had been those, but in the sustained daily accumulation of a life shared between 2 people who had started as strangers and had built from the ground up something that neither of them could have made alone. She thought sometimes about the letter she had opened in her father's dry goods store in Millhaven in the spring of 1883, the careful handwriting, and the words that had surprised her with their honesty. She thought about the drive from Caldwell to the ranch, the night beside the creek with the stars unreasonably large overhead. She thought about the first evening she had sat on this porch and known that she was in love with him, and the morning she had told him so, and the way his face had looked. She thought about Samuel's first morning in the world in Alina's, and Amos standing in the doorway with his complicated emotions arranged as a critical assessment. She thought about the water rights case and the letters to the land office, and the evening on the porch after they got Reeves Monroe's letter, and the particular quality of relief and triumph that had been in the air that night. She thought about her father walking the ranch with Daniel, and the nod he had given at the supper table that contained everything it needed to contain. She had, she understood, been very fortunate. Not in the passive sense of fortune as something that simply arrives, but in the sense that she had been brave enough once, at 24, to open a letter and write back and get on a train and come to an unknown place and trust that the man who had written about wanting a partner had meant it. She had been brave enough once, and it had turned out to be enough. On a spring morning in 1905, 22 years after she had arrived at the Langston Ranch with her trunk and her traveling bag, Henrietta walked out of the kitchen door into the kitchen garden in the early light before Daniel was awake and looked at the limestone house, and the garden and the barn and the pastures rolling away toward the creek and the ridge beyond. and she felt the completeness of things in a way that was neither complacent nor finished, but simply whole. Daniel came out of the kitchen door 10 minutes later with 2 cups of coffee and found her standing in the garden path looking at the ridge. He said, "What are you looking at?" She said, "Everything." He came and stood beside her and handed her the coffee and looked at the ridge with her. He said, "Coop thinks we should expand the herd by 20 head this season. He has a point, the grazing's been good." She said, "He's probably right." He said, "Samuel mentioned in his last letter that he's thinking about coming back in the fall, permanently, taking on more of the operation." She said, "Good, it's time. The place will be his one day and he should know every part of it." He said, Alina wrote, "She's finished her first clinical rotation, and apparently she is very good at it. Her supervisor said so in formal terms that she copied out for us word for word." Henrietta felt something warm move through her at this. She said, "Of course she is." He said, "She also said there is a young man." Henrietta turned and looked at him. He was looking at the ridge with the expression of someone pretending to be neutral about something. She said, "What kind of young man?" He said. From her letter she described him as a fellow student with a particular interest in surgery. She said he is from a family in Virginia and that she met him in an anatomy lecture. She said, "And?" He said, and she described the anatomy lecture in considerable detail and mentioned him 11 times in 4 paragraphs, which in my experience of Alina means she is being careful not to say too much about something she cares about very much. Henrietta looked back at the ridge. She said, "She's 20. He said, "You were 24 when you answered an advertisement from a stranger in Texas." She said, "That is different." He said, "Is it?" She considered this. She said, "No, not really." A pause. "I hope he's worthy of her," Daniel said. "God help him if he isn't." She laughed at that, a real laugh, and he laughed too, and the spring morning was warm and clear, and the creek was running below the house and Captain's descendants were moving in the east pasture, and the kitchen garden was just beginning to push up the first green shoots of the season, and she had everything she had come here looking for and more than she had known to hope for, and she knew it, and she was grateful. She leaned against Daniel's shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the kitchen garden in the spring morning with the coffee cups warm in their hands and the whole of the Langston ranch around them, and the life they had built hummed and breathed and turned itself toward another day. He said, "Are you happy, Henrietta?" She said, without any hesitation at all, completely. He pressed his lips to the top of her head and held her close in the spring morning, and the creek ran below the house, and the cattle moved in the pasture, and the bluebonnets were coming up along the ridge, and the day had everything in it that a day could have, and the life was whole.